And we're on live from all over the world. It's the BCBC, the book with the Biblical Criticism Book Club. Welcome. Today, we are discussing the first chapter of Hermann Detering's The Fabricated Paul.
And is this book also known by a couple other names because of the translation?
Yeah, because of the different translations, it's also been known as the Falsified Paul. I think those are the two main names, though, that it's known by.
Okay.
I think when I
thought
first
you were going to get into the German.
What's that?
I thought Wayne was going to volunteer the German original.
I don't do German.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Welcome, V. Morgan. Okay, so where do we start?
Who here has
The book?
Who here has read the
Oops. Were you saying something, V? Okay, maybe not. Okay, the book is a book that centers on it tries to represent the thesis of the Tübingen school, which developed into the Dutch Radical school, which specifically argues that the Pauline corpus, that none of it is authentic, in contrast to No, I think we have a problem with that.
Reuven, can you mute that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, we couldn't understand you. It just sounded like a whiny sound.
So it represents the case of the Dutch radicals, which was specifically if F.C. Bauer reduced the number of the genuine Pauline epistles to 4, the Dutch radicals went ahead and posited that for the same kind of reasoning, none of the Pauline corpus is authentic. And that's the essential thesis of the book. The first chapter tries to demonstrate all the different reasonings why they would even be called into question in the first place. Do you think I pretty much approximated that?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So he kind of starts out asking if we know anything about Paul from the Book of Acts. So what does the Book of Acts reliably tell us about Paul?
I think his conclusion was it was basically a fairy tale.
Yeah, and I'm willing to follow him regarding that, and I think the Acts seminar is also willing to follow him on that. I read this a while back, the Acts seminar report, and
yeah,
they came to the conclusion that very little in the Book of Acts is likely to be historical. They didn't say absolutely nothing. They picked a few isolated things here and there they thought maybe are historical, but for the most part, the vast majority they believe to be fictional.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that scholarship in general has been tending toward that conclusion for like 100 years now.
Yeah.
Although I did find it interesting that, was it F.C. Bauer? That
Yeah.
Ferdinand Bauer, who, well, he argued, I thought, for the 4 instead of the 7 letters as being genuine, but still, I thought it was him that was questioning the book of Romans because it disagreed with Acts, and he trusted the book of Acts as a reliable history, and that's why he was willing to let go of Pauline epistle for the sake of his trust in Acts, and
right, that was not F.C. Bauer. That was it starts with an S, an English gentleman. It was the very first time. It was the very first time that somebody had questioned the authenticity of a Pauline epistle, and it's actually the letter of the Romans. It was in the 1770s, and I forget his name.
The Unitarian person, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting that the very first time that somebody would question the authenticity of a Pauline letter, it actually turned out to be, his reasoning turned out to be because he actually trusted Acts more. Which I think there's a nice little bit of irony there.
Yeah, it is.
It's on page 44 that Detering mentions it. The Englishman Edward Evanson, 1731 to 1805.
Right.
Yeah.
But then when the Tübingen, I don't know how that's pronounced, but I'm going to say Tübingen. When the Tübingen school came along and F.C. Bauer had his heyday and his influence, he followed Schleiermacher and I think it was Schmidtals. I may be wrong about that second one. He followed, but Schleiermacher for sure. Schleiermacher demonstrated that the second letter of Timothy and both letters to Timothy were very, very likely inauthentic, and he gave some reasoning for that. F.C. Bauer, following similar kind of reasoning, showed, and it had to do with language, statistical use of words, and stylistic issues, came to the conclusion that none, except for the four really big letters, he called them, were authentically Pauline letters.
Yeah. And I'm quite willing to reject the pastoral epistles as being authentic based on them not having been part of Marcion's Apostolicon.
Sure.
But the other 10 I like to consider as a unit, and I have reservations about breaking them up.
Right, but that's a really good point, and I'm glad that you do, because it needs to be discussed in terms of specifically what the reasoning for that is, and I think that he gives a really good case that that's a case of what's the word that I should use? Like, we're doing that out of habit, and there's no real good reason to do so.
Yep.
I agree with you, Wayne, that I think the pastorals are the weakest case of all. I mean, the weakest claim on being authentic, and
yep.
I'm happiest of all to get rid of them. I generally speak myself in terms of 7 authentic letters, but I'm both open for them. Let's say I'm willing to either agree with the 10, the 7, the 4, or none. I'm really open.
Yeah. I need to learn what the arguments are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's what this book is.
Yeah. One issue I have is I think a lot of the study of the Pauline epistles has been really confused because they haven't done enough background to distinguish the original documents from the interpolations later, like the original Marcionite versions from the expanded versions of the Catholic Church has. And I think a lot of scholars look at some of what's said in the interpolated portions and use that as evidence that the entire epistle must be late. But I don't necessarily buy that. I think if a lot of these arguments are just using the interpolated portions, then the non-interpolated portion could be, still be first century.
No, that's a very good point. In fact, I just posted a question on Facebook that in my opinion, it's one thing that I struggle with when it comes to these issues of what's authentic and what's not, and who was Paul, if there was a Paul. And it dealt with basically his view of Jesus as the demiurge, and basically Marcion's view of the demiurge, and then what would he think of Jesus, like this idea that Jesus is the demiurge in Paul, and Marcion obviously has a bias against the demiurge. The demiurge is evil. In fact, I posted that my understanding from Dr. Price is that Marcion's idea of the ransom is that Jesus buys mankind from the demiurge. Since he's the creator, the demiurge, he has the right to all mankind. But Jesus comes to buy mankind from the demiurge for the Father. So obviously the Father's not the creator, and in this view, Jesus couldn't be the creator either. The creator or demiurge is another party, a third party, but yet Paul, these Pauline texts, I think, I've been convinced, like Margaret Barker, and I was convinced before that Paul believed, that is, let's put it this way, that Paul's letters refer to Jesus with texts that spoke of Jehovah or Yahweh, and so, but Reuven made a comment that he thought those must be interpolations. That's one reason I bring this up now, Wayne, is because you're talking about when these interpolated texts, they throw the discussion off.
Yeah.
And so if those examples were just interpolated, because the whole time I struggled with trying to figure out how would Marcion have dealt with these specific texts, but if they were never part of his text to begin with, then they weren't a problem for him. But I could imagine then the Orthodox Church going in and adding them to throw off Gnosticism, to throw off Marcion's particular brand, of thinking.
Yes. Like I said, I need to know exactly what passages you're talking about, and we'd have to deal with them one by one on a case-by-case basis. And the very first thing I would do is look at various reconstructions of Marcion's Bible and see if there's evidence. See if people doing the reconstructions included those passages or not. Like see whether Jason Badun included those or not.
Right. But from our discussions and what you've mentioned from Badun, I'm open to the idea that Marcion's version of Paul's letters might have been the original versions, and possibly even he and his group wrote them, But if not, if there was an authentic Paul, he may have had the originals that were later redacted.
I don't believe Marcion wrote them because, as you said, there's too many contradictions between the Pauline epistles and Marcion's theology. Even though Marcion held them dear, I don't see enough correspondence to think that Marcion wrote them. So I do think there's something older than Marcion that he just adopted.
If I may, I think I'm a little bit confused by your question, Dale. Who do you think equated Jesus to the demiurge?
I think Paul's letters do.
You think Paul's letters? Yeah.
That was an important point. That was an important point from Margaret Barker, especially the last chapter, I think, which dealt with the New Testament evidence.
Yeah.
And Jesus, two gods. Jesus is Jehovah, and Paul is one of the major supporters of that idea. You obviously had to buy into it to buy into her argument. I don't know if you did think that Paul's letters did.
No, I don't think Paul's letter paints Jesus as the demiurge. I would not agree with that. I mean, like Wayne said, we'd have to look at the verses.
Whether it paints Jesus as creator or not, I know there are verses in the Pauline epistles that call Jesus the creator.
As creator, yes.
I'd have to double check whether those are part of the original Marcionite text or the interpolated text. But they're probably original to the Marcionite text, but I'm not certain offhand.
Creator in the sense of logos, yes. Creator in the sense of demiurgus, I don't think so.
How do you understand? Because my understanding of demiurge means creator. There's no difference.
Well, yeah, but I think there's a difference in the concepts, and I think that's one of the places where Margaret Barker, in my opinion, is too willing to what's the word? To blend those together where they don't necessarily need to be. In other words, yeah, you're right. Demiurgus means creator in the Gnostic sense.
But you don't think that. But you're saying you don't think that Paul believed that Jesus was the creator, the one who sustained.
I don't.
That all things.
I don't think
that all things came into being through him and for him, like he was the one that created all things.
Right. I think that the Philonic idea of the Logos is not the same thing as the demiurge.
Well, I don't want to. I mean, I don't feel comfortable. You could possibly convince me otherwise, but I don't feel comfortable to equate the word Logos with creator.
Right.
In my opinion, demiurge equals creator, but not Logos.
Yeah, I don't remember Paul calling Jesus Logos. I remember him using other terms that indicate Jesus as creator, but I don't remember him calling Jesus Logos.
Yeah, but I think it's an extension of the idea. In other words, when Philo talks about the Logos being the Logos, to me is the unifying logic and by extension creative aspect of the world.
Yeah, I'm aware of tie-ins between the Johannine writings and Philo, but I'm not really aware of good direct continuity between the Pauline corpus and Philo. So I have a hard time basing anything on a connection there.
But I can see what you're saying, Leon, on that tie-in. I guess, I mean, obviously, like you say, Wayne, Paul doesn't explicitly call him the Logos.
Reuven just posted a bunch.
By the way, anyway, you probably knew I was a fan of Margaret Barker, so as far as the idea of, I don't think John drew on Philo in particular. I think Philo bought into the general zeitgeist, if you want to call it that, of the Logos idea. In other words, the memra of the Aramaic Targums is the same thing. In other words, the authors of the Aramaic Targums were not indebted to Philo, and thus, in my opinion, neither was John. They all were speaking the same language.
The fact that we're able to formulate a question such as yours is kind of good evidence of just how convoluted a concept the whole thing is. Because I don't think Jesus is ever represented as the demiurgus.
By the way, Reuven, Reuven, this would have been a perfect time for you actually to speak to us with your beloved voice, but to explain what you think on what you mean on this. But he's giving specific chapters where he thinks the light idea of Logos can be found in Paul, like Romans 7, 1 Corinthians 14, 2 Corinthians 9, and so forth.
Instances in books.
He's giving me chapter references, not verse references, so it's taken me a bit of effort to find the verse.
Okay, yeah. How many uses of the actual word Logos he's saying? He uses the word Logos itself, he's saying.
Oh, I see.
Those are okay. No,
so 7 occurrences in Romans.
Oh, those aren't chapters. I gotcha. So I can't look it up now. Then it's too much work.
Yeah.
But just because he's using the word logos, I mean that's a common Greek word. I mean, is he using it in the Johannine and in Philonic sense or not? I don't remember him doing that. I'll have to look at those again.
There you go. So, but I mean, I guess it's kind of a long chapter, but it can be pretty much.
Yeah, I think we jumped ahead too fast, though. I was trying to help us go systematically, and I think we jumped really quickly past the question out of the Book of Acts.
Well, we can back up.
Yeah, we talked about the Acts seminar, accepting that it's pretty much fictional. It has very little or no history in it. But we really didn't explain to the listeners here why. So I mean, do you want to explain, Leon, why you come to the conclusion that Acts is mostly fictional?
Well, there are kind of so many that I should have been taking notes, and I kind of did reading without highlighting this time. But it seems to me one of the reasons what sticks out in my mind was in Acts, one of the main functions put the disciples, or the 12, whatever that might mean, on the same level as Paul, or rather to put Paul on the same authority level as the 12. Whereas when you look at the epistles are almost insolently challenging the 12, talking back to the 12, so to speak. Ones to me.
Yeah, and it's also mentioned that in the Pauline epistles, Paul emphasizes strongly his qualifications as an apostle, but yet the book of Acts kind of downplays that and doesn't really call him an apostle.
Right, exactly.
I see the book of Acts as basically making Paul united with the Jerusalem church. They're buddies, and following the direction of the Jerusalem church, whereas Paul's letters seem to be at odds with them, and basically Paul has no respect for them, basically. They're nothing to him. He didn't get his gospel from them. He got it from divine revelation personally. So
Right.
This idea, it feels like Acts is intentionally trying to bridge this divide and make it look like there was a united church from the beginning.
Right, and in Galatians he says, I didn't get my gospel from any man. And then in Acts, when he falls down blind on the road to Damascus, he gets his gospel from Ananias.
But I know the Acts Seminar report, it goes through the book of Acts passage by passage, and at the end of each one it asks, in search of history, and it has a discussion of that passage and which elements in the passage look like they're more likely to be included because of purposes in the narrative or polemical purposes, and then what details seem incidental or things that are probably included because they're true, that the author is in a sense forced to include. And in almost every case they find all the details to serving a particular narrative purpose, and to be polemical.
Yeah, I think Joseph Tyson and John Knox and David Trobish and scholars like that make a really, really good case for that, for the idea that Acts was a tendentious composition to more or less unify different strands of Christianity that were kind of congealing into what we now know as orthodoxy.
Yeah, and Acts also makes Peter and Paul almost clones of each other.
Yes.
It tries to make Paul more Petrine, and it tries to make Peter more Pauline. And it ends up they're both almost identical in how they speak.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That was one of the points that really hit home for me when I was reading.
Wayne, would you type in the title of the book in the sidebar, just for my future reference?
Which book? The Badun book?
Next seminar you're talking about?
Oh yeah, okay.
Oh yeah, the Acts Seminar. It's the Westar Institute's the equivalent of when they did the Jesus Seminar, or the analog.
Oh, did they do the Acts Seminar first? Or did that come before the Jesus Seminar?
Yeah.
After.
No, they did the Jesus Seminar was.
By the way, while he's typing that, oh, there it is.
The words of Jesus.
Acts and Christian Beginnings. Cool. Thank you. By the way, I can hold this till later, of course, but I entered it, when we were talking about a text that would indicate that Paul believed Jesus was the creator. The one that came to my mind is the Colossians 1:16. I typed that in the sidebar. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him.
Yeah, I've been meaning.
Yeah, I get that. I get
Badun, and I keep getting sidetracked.
Dale, see where you're getting that, but I think that may make sense of Barker, but it makes no sense of Marcion.
Exactly, and so I would suggest if that were true, then Wayne would be right. This idea that it's an example of interpolation, because actually
Badun does not include that verse in his reconstruction.
There you go.
He goes basically starting at verse 14. Oh no, where should I start? I'll just start at verse 15. Who is an image of the unseen God, and then he jumps to 17. And he is before all, and everything coexists in him. And he is the head of the body of the assembly, who is the primary firstborn from the dead, so that he might become first in everything. And then verse 19, because he thought well of all the fullness dwelling in himself, etc. This is a long sentence in the Greek. But yeah, Badun doesn't include verse 16 in the reconstruction. Now I can look at Badun's notes to see if he has a reason for excluding it.
Oh yeah, please. In fact, I'm so glad you even thought to look this up under Badun.
Yeah, this is cool. Thank you.
It takes me around a minute to find it here.
But this supports. It was Reuven actually that brought this up in a comment that on the post that I left on Facebook, basically where he said he didn't think that there was any authentic Pauline text that supported this idea that Jesus is the creator. That he thought it was I assumed that meant it was an interpolation,
Yeah, I have to study that issue.
Yeah, because
Okay, in Badun's notes, he's referring to the second half of verse.
Then Marcion's whole school would be closed down.
Yeah. Okay. I'm reading Badun's notes. He has reference from Tertullian that the first half of verse 15 was included, but he says that the second half of verse 15 and verse 16 is an omission. And Tertullian appears to say that Marcion's text lacked 15 and 16. If Christ is not the firstborn of creation, as being that word of the Creator by whom all things were made and without whom nothing was made, if it is not true that in him all things were created in heaven and on earth, things visible and things invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, if it is not true that by him and in him all things were created, for it was really necessary that Marcion would disapprove of this, then the apostle would not have stated so plainly, and he is before all. For how can he be before all if he were not before all things? And how before all things if he were not the firstborn of creation? That's verses Marcion, Book 5, Chapter 19, verses 3 through 5, Tertullian. And then Badun says about this, while there have been a great many proposals for the original wording of the hymn used by Paul in this part of the letter, and the possibility of various interpolations, I have not been able to find one that exactly corresponds to the form found in the Apostolicon as reported by Tertullian, although suggestions for editorial expansions or interpolations in verse 16 are quite common. For those conditioned by the Catholic form of the text, the redundancy of verse 17 with 5b and 16 has passed unnoticed. One would expect at least a therefore rather than an and at the beginning of verse 17. Likewise, the perception of a supposed balance of the hymn in its Catholic form rests upon the assumption that the hymn begins with verse 15. However, verses 12 and 14 possess the same formal properties and cannot be excluded from the consideration for the overall structure and meaning of the hymn. It could be argued that the form of the passage attested for the Apostolicon possesses an equally clear structure and coherent meaning without the second half of verse 15 and verse 16, and with or without verse 18. So that's Badun's long footnote about that verse.
So he thinks it is not authentic, bottom line.
Yeah, that's his bottom line, yeah.
And you guys were convinced from reading Badun that you felt Marcion had an earlier version of Paul's letters than the version that we have. In other words, or shall I say, you were convinced that he was not a redactor of the materials that he had. Is that right?
I was convinced from Couchot.
Yeah, I was convinced.
But Badun actually made me moderate my stance a little bit, actually. Because Couchot gave me a radical stance about that, and Badun maybe moderated a bit. But I still believe that in the most part, Marcion's version is the more original.
Yeah, I follow not just Badun. I first got the idea from Joseph Tyson, and then subsequently from John Knox, and then also from Badun. And I think I haven't started reading the Liu book yet, but I got a feeling that's where she's going also.
Yeah. Yeah, I apologize. Even though I've read all the way through the Acts Seminar report, it's difficult for me to summarize why I think the Book of Acts is entirely fictional. But I am very convinced by it, and I think they give a good argument for it. That's maybe a book we should do, and maybe for this hangout at a different time. But,
yeah, I think it's not rocket surgery to figure out. I think that Acts is completely tendentious and fictional.
yeah. Now, one of the scholars that Detering was quoting talked about the Pauline epistles. What's the term I want? Being dependent on Acts, like them having references back to the Book of Acts in them, so that if Acts is shown to be 2nd century, these epistles have to be later than that.
Right.
I'm not convinced by that, though. I'm strongly convinced from some arguments that the Acts Seminar report contains, and some other places I read, but I can't think who it was.
He does mention
that. I think Acts basically knows the letters. I think it's vice versa. I think Acts has references to content of the letters.
Well, I think what Detering is saying, though, is that they came up in parallel. He seems to think that the letters knew Acts and that the Acts knew the letters, and that they're reacting to each other.
Yeah, I'd have to be convinced of that. I'm convinced that Acts knew the letters, but I'm not convinced vice versa.
Right.
Well, for instance, the one example of why someone might think so is the polemical opening in Galatians. I guess I can't go exactly into what he said, but it has something to do with who is the polemic toward? Who is it reacting to when he's saying, when he's talking down to about the 12, about the Jerusalem people?
I'm not sure I followed that, but okay, I'll have to think about that later.
I have a question, Wayne. In that book on the Acts Seminar,
yes,
on page 16 of the PDF, Detering is talking about the old methodology about the historical Acts versus the Pauline epistles. It says everything that somehow seems miraculous or imaginary is unhistorical. And everything on the contrary that proceeds in a rational and natural way and also agrees somehow with the letters is historical. The few things that the Acts Seminar found historical, would you say that was like the underlying methodology, or was it something else?
I can't remember offhand what they found historical.
Do you remember why they found it historical?
Actually,
I don't think they actually had a reason for thinking it's historical. It's that they didn't have enough reason to discount it as historical. I think they're trying to give it the benefit of the doubt unless it seems unlikely to be historical, and they're pointing out that most of this is unlikely to have been.
Yeah, I think that the Westar Institute generally has a hermeneutic of charity. I think they do give stuff the benefit of the doubt. Interesting Stug. What's a Stug? I don't know what he means.
I'm sure
stuff.
He meant
Stuff. Got it.
Stuff, yeah.
Got it. Okay, never mind. Sorry.
interpolation.
Oh.
Yeah, but basically what Detering says, in the first dozen pages or a couple dozen pages of this is pretty much I agree with him across the board on. I mean, he doesn't say anything that's controversial to me, although I know to a lot of conservatives and stuff, it's radical to the point of absurdity in their mind, but I find most of what he says here quite plausible early on. But later on in this chapter, there's a lot of assertions he makes that I have to just double check. I don't know if I can agree with them.
Some years ago, when I first read the book, I remember looking around online and I found criticisms of Detering's book from conservative angles, and yeah, they did not appreciate him at all. He got lambasted.
But I mean, I'm willing to accept that Acts is mostly, if not entirely, fictional. And they wouldn't go that far. So.
By the way, when you were talking about when we're comparing the Pauline letters with Acts, one thing that I found interesting was on page 61. Since we're talking about it, though I know Wayne, we're jumping ahead, but
Yeah.
he was comparing the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. He says, I'm just going to read this part. He says, while the 15th chapter of Acts contains the so-called apostolic decree that prescribes that Gentiles abstain from blood and what is strangled and unchastity, he says a requirement that was continuously followed by Catholic Christians of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and which had no efficacy except in Gnostic and Marcionite communities. The writer of Galatians knows nothing about this decree in the passage where he relates the meetings in Jerusalem. See, I found that interesting because not only so Galatians doesn't include this decree, and it doesn't reflect, and that decree, if it were true, didn't reflect the Gnostic and Marcionite communities, but it did reflect the community practice in the Catholic Christians. And so the idea that Acts 15 was created by a Catholic community that followed that, and it would seem to support the idea that Galatians, on the other hand, they were aware of, in their opinion, this may have happened, but it never, there was no such decree, and it didn't inform their communities, either that they were responsible for the Galatians text, or, they had the original before it was changed.
Yeah. To put some of this in perspective, traditionally thought that the author of Acts and the author of Luke are the same person. That they're both supposedly written by Luke, and they both have similar prologues to them. Which is why that claim is made. But the Marcionite Gospel appears to have been, seems to be like a condensement of Luke, but in the opposite way. Actually, Luke seems to be an expansion of the Marcionite Gospel. And basically, I believe, and I think a lot of others do, that the interpolations in Luke are written by the same 2nd century proto-Catholic writer that wrote Acts. So the interpolator is the same, and the entire book of Acts is from the interpolator, but the original stratum of Luke goes back to the earlier times and is by a different author.
I once read a really good book. I think it was called. It was by a guy named Michael Parsons, I think. It was The Unity of Luke Acts or something like that, where he goes into this concept in detail. If you guys are interested in this.
And what's his thesis? Is he a conservative or is he a radical critic or what?
He's more to the left. He's not conservative, but he's not necessarily radical, I don't think. In other words, he still retains some of the idea that it was the same. That it was the same. There's reasons to think that it was the same. Let's say editor.
Yeah.
But the unity as we understand it is not as clear and as we think.
Yeah, I believe the prologue to Luke was added by the person who interpolated into Luke and wrote Acts in order to tie the books together.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, about Theophilus, that incident.
Yeah. Yes. So
you're saying that the authors of Luke and Acts were different, but that a redactor came in and made it look like they were.
My view is actually that there was an original writer of the original part of Luke, which is pretty much the same as the Marcionite Gospel, and then a later editor expanded Luke and then wrote Acts.
I see. So whoever wrote Acts, he's a redactor of Luke.
I believe so, yeah. At least that's the simplest theory. There may be reasons to go with a more complicated theory, but I don't know them at this time.
It's a helpful model that I want to write it down just as a possible, very, very real possibility, yeah.
Well, I have to say, actually, before we continue, I'd like to say that I really, really appreciate Hermann Detering, if only because the only other people who even bother talking about the influence of the Tübingen School and the Dutch radicals are Robert Price and the late Darrell Doty.
Yeah.
And I think, and I think that their ideas are so strong, and they were basically just they put the scholarship put a kibosh on them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that their ideas are so strong that it's kind of unfortunate that they're not really given the due that they're due.
Yeah. I like that on page 15 here that Detering mentions Alice in Wonderland. I was reciting Jabberwocky before the Hangout went live.
Right on. We're gonna make you recite it later.
I just give him kudos for having the reference. I did have another question here. In previous Hangouts, I've heard it said that that the term rabbi was like a later development. That it's not a early first century terminology.
Right.
So does that mean that Gamaliel was not called rabbi, or I mean, who was Gamaliel?
No, it means that Gamaliel was interjected into the story later.
Okay. So when did the real Gamaliel live, and who was he?
He was a first century.
He was a first
century teacher. Whether he was, again, I still have to be convinced on the rabbi issue, but he was one of the most influential. He may have been the most important teacher in first century Jerusalem. If you ever read Chaim Maccabee, he makes it clear from his. He makes a huge point about explaining why he feels it's impossible that Paul ever studied under Gamaliel.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I agree with that part of. I think Maccabee is kind of radical in a couple of places, but I agree with Maccabee on that.
So Gamaliel would have been mid-first century then, not late first century. So the idea of him being a contemporary with Paul is plausible from a chronological standpoint.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't see anybody making a problem with the timing issue. Although you're mentioning the rabbi question is anyway, that's an added question. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know what to make of it, but X calling him rabbi, if that's an anachronism.
Well, that's the point. Is that textually speaking, at least, we don't know what the popular use of words were, obviously, but textually speaking, the word rabbi is not represented really anywhere until the New Testament.
Okay.
I kind of wonder if when they say that, like when Dr. Price says that, if he means the concept. I mean, if rabbi just means teacher, then I don't see
a big deal. Yeah.
There were obviously teachers before that, and so there's the question whether the term rabbi was ever used at that time, or is it just the modern idea of a rabbi, which is basically he's the sole leader of a synagogue. You know, because I don't see Gamaliel as that type of rabbi, and any type of Jesus as a rabbi in the Gospels is not used in that way either. That he's the leader in a synagogue. You know.
Right. It's like the Japanese word sensei, which means teacher.
Yeah.
And I think only because immediately following the fall of Jerusalem, we started getting stuff like the Mishnah and the Talmud and stuff like that. The common usage of the word rabbi became what we know it now, and I think a lot of the time we kind of retroject that meaning into the past, and it's not necessarily so. I think you are correct.
Yeah, I like what Detering says on page 17 of this. I'm using the page numbers that are printed on the pages. It's actually the 19th page of the PDF, but the page number is 17. That it's also very remarkable that the supposed student of Gamaliel, who certainly would have received instruction from him in the original Hebrew text of the Old Testament, cites passages from the Old Testament exclusively from the Greek version, as if in his life he had never learned Hebrew.
Yeah, that's one of the big points for me. And it's not that Paul couldn't be using the Septuagint, because after all, he is supposedly preaching in the West, But if he was a student of Gamaliel in Jerusalem, that's a problem.
Yeah.
But why? I mean, you just mentioned. I guess I didn't take it as a problem because of just the reason you gave, that here he's writing a Greek letter to Greek-speaking people, and so naturally he's going to quote the Greek Old Testament. What do you expect otherwise?
Well, I expect that somebody who is well-rooted in the Jerusalem, in the Hebrew Bible, would probably, once he became familiar with the Septuagint, would, how would I say this, would adjust.
I would expect somebody familiar with Hebrew to give his translations of it in his own words, give his own translations.
Right, exactly. In other words, if I first learned, no, that's not going to be a good analogy, but it seems to me that we quote what we're familiar with, not what's in front of us, kind of.
In other words, I mean, well, Wayne, that's what I thought you'd have to suggest, is basically that he would. You're suggesting he should translate it in his mind, instead of using the translation that they have in common. In other words, these people have the Greek Septuagint as their Bible, and to me it seems reasonable for him to quote that instead of translating himself, giving his own translation. But for some reason it seems more logical to you that he should translate it himself because he knows both languages.
It's like when I read things from Richard Elliott Friedman, and he's talking about things in the Pentateuch. He doesn't bother giving the King James or NIV or New Revised Standard. He just gives his own translation because he's fluent in Hebrew, and that's the normal thing we see with people who are fluent in these original languages. They tend not to use standard translations of stuff, but to give their own.
I agree with Wayne. We quote, in other words, we quote what it's like if he really came up through the ranks in Jerusalem and knows his Torah back and forth, which, by the way, Maccabee demonstrates that he doesn't, but that's a different topic. But if that was me, I would be using my understanding of Torah as I absorbed it, not as I'm looking at it.
And even if that was a valid argument, which it might be a valid argument, I just have to think about it for a little while more. But it just discounts the historicity of the Acts about Paul. As this Jew that grew up and studied under Gamaliel and so forth. If you're willing to say Acts is not real history, it doesn't say anything about the Pauline epistle, the authenticity of the Pauline epistles. Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of why Detering brought it up, though. He was still kind of, trying to weed the reader off the Book of Acts as being history.
Okay. Yeah. By the way, even though, like you, Leon, I've been reading the Kindle version, I did have to get a copy of the PDF because, for the sake of page numbers, I knew using that during this discussion.
Now that it comes up, though, I would appreciate it if you guys would kind of slide me a PDF version.
I posted a link to it in the BCVC Facebook page. Oh,
did you? I'm sorry, I missed it.
Yeah. Detering also talks about, still regarding the Book of Acts, Stephen plays no great role in early Christian literature, and that his martyrdom falls entirely into the background next to that of James, the brother of the Lord, in 66 CE. And he's talking about the fact that these two figures almost seem to be like the same person, just referred to in different names. But that the Acts account of it just seems to be polemical and not really historical. And more evidence of Acts not being trustworthy.
Well, using James as a model, but I would also argue that the story of Stephen is using Jesus himself as a model.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because I was going to say, well, you probably know that Robert Eisenman's idea that he's portraying James's martyrdom in the guise of Stephen, and part of the point is, well, whether you think it's James or Jesus himself, he does point out that the name Stephen just refers to Stephanos, is the Greek word for crown, given to a martyr, and so.
Yeah. There's another argument I have for Acts being fictional, I don't remember Detering using it, and I don't actually remember the Acts Seminary referring to it. They may have. I may have forgotten if they mentioned it. But there's lots of duplication of stuff from Homer and from Euripides. Like the account of Pentecost is described in terms very similar to an account in the Bacchae, where the servants of Bacchus have flames of fire above their heads, not burned. The same thing is happening in Acts. And in both cases, they're speaking in weird language, in weird tongues, basically. Although Acts interprets it actually being different languages. I think the Bacchae just has weird babblings and stuff. But also there's an account, I forget what chapter of Acts, where Paul is speaking and there's a person in a window listening to him, and Paul's going on preaching for hour after hour.
And he bores them to death.
And he bores them to death, and he falls out the window. And I believe afterwards in Acts, Paul has mercy on him and does a miracle and brings him back to life. But there is a passage in the Odyssey, or either the Iliad or the Odyssey, it's in Homer, that's very similar to that.
Yeah, I'm familiar with this argument. Yeah, you're right about that. And I think it's in the Iliad.
In the Iliad, yeah, where a person falls out of the window. I don't remember. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the Iliad to remember who was speaking there and who was preaching, whatever it was. But in the Iliad case, the name of the guy there, I forget the guy's name, but it's something that kind of could be taken to mean like unfortunate or something.
Yes.
And the name of the person in Acts is a very similar name, but it's switched around to a word that could mean blessed or fortunate, because he was actually saved after. He was actually brought back to life afterwards.
Right.
But there's so many similarities between the passages. It's pretty clear. Yeah, Elpenor from the Odyssey, Reuven says. And I think it's Eutychus or something in Acts. Something like that.
I just found it. His name is Eutychus.
Yeah. But there's dozens of similarities between the two stories, making it pretty clear. Dennis R. MacDonald has an article about that he argues very persuasively, in my opinion, that the Acts was inspired by the Odyssey account.
Does the
but that comes back to the whole. That holds. There's also situations in Acts where people escape from prison due to earthquakes, and that's also similar to things from the Bacchae.
Does the Acts seminar go into some of those things you were mentioning, Wayne?
I think it may have. I don't remember. It's been a while since I read the book. I think it does. Not in as much detail as I think Price does in his book, The Case Against the Case of Christ. On the Case Against the Case for Christ is where Price mentions it, and not as much detail as MacDonald does. But yeah, they do mention it. There's also a quote from the Euripides. Something about kicking against the goads. I forget the exact quote.
Oh, I think I recognize it. Yeah.
And that's also in Acts. And there's something peculiar about that too.
Like the plural.
Yeah, the plural part of it. Yeah, you'd think you'd kick against the goad on one side.
Yeah.
But due to the poetic nature of the Iliad, I think the plural word must have a longer cadence or another syllable. I don't know the exact word to it, so I can't tell you offhand. So the author of Iliad, so Homer used the plural term to make it fit the poetic meter he was using.
Right, and the fact that Paul retains the transformation into the plural is good evidence that he used it and not the other way around. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in Acts that parallels the Greek literature. But now, if Acts was supposed to be a historical account of given actual history, why would they need to be borrowing stuff from pagan literature?
More than that, why would they need to be borrowing stuff from Josephus, which is one of the arguments that
another argument, yeah.
Yeah.
Can you give an example of something borrowed from Josephus in Acts?
Oh no, I'd have to look. I'd have to kind of go digging a little bit, but I think I got that from. I think I was reading Carrier at the time. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think there's an argument that the interpolator of Luke has added some stuff from Josephus.
I think it has to do. I think it has to do with the specific order of incidents and people being named.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That was in Acts. When they're talking about the certain people, remember when Gamaliel and the other men of the Sanhedrin are considering what to do with the apostles, and they mention about Judas the Galilean and about Judas. The order that they give is completely following Josephus, is the way he tells it, but it's out of chronological order.
Exactly, and that's why it's really strong evidence that the author of Acts might be following Josephus after the year 96.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so any conservatives, listening to this this hangout, off of YouTube later, we're not ditching on the Book of Acts just because, it's the basic historical document for early Christianity. We hate Christianity, so we want to get rid of the book wherever we can. I mean, no, there are real problems in the text that, the only real way to make sense of these issues is to understand Acts as being fiction.
Yes, I'd like to go on the record as saying that I love the Bible.
Yeah, same here.
Me too.
So there.
By the way, whenever apologists though want to talk about the how the Book of Acts is, because they still won't give up this idea that the Book of Acts is still a historically reliable source, and they give all kinds of examples to show things that the author was aware of that only happened. Somebody had to be living during that time to be aware of all these things. Even Greg Boyd still,
I know.
where he listed all kinds of things. I would love to see an engagement point by point on these issues, but would the Book of Acts, Acts Seminar book be a good source for rejoinders for that sort of argument?
I believe the Acts Seminar report is an excellent introduction to the critical scholarship on the Book of Acts. For somebody who's not read critical scholarship on the book before, it's a great first book to read on the subject.
Which one?
The Acts Seminar report.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was gonna suggest. I think the best one is Richard Purvo, but that might be a little bit. I think probably that one should be read first before Purvo.
The Acts Seminar report is written in a very clear manner, and it's written for a general audience. It's written as an introductory text. It covers scholarly issues, but it's written to be very accessible.
By the way, Wayne, this idea that you had given earlier about the idea of that Luke was written by a Marcion, and then...
No, I don't necessarily say that. Marcion used an earlier version of the Gospel of Luke. Whether it was written by a Marcionite or whether it was an earlier text that Marcion adopted is a different question.
Yeah, and I don't think Marcion wrote. I really don't think Marcion wrote it. I think Marcion inherited the text.
Yeah, and I believe Luke itself, is. I agree with Goodacre's view that it's derivative from both Mark and Matthew.
Okay, but what you had said was that the author of Acts redacted Luke. Wherever it derived, you believe that the author of Acts redacted Luke to make it look like it was by the same author, and you're just making the case that...
Well, I believe that the gospel that the Marcionites have was the writer of Acts took that Marcionite gospel, and by Marcion I mean the one they used, not necessarily claiming that they're the origins of it.
Right.
But the Catholics took that Marcionite gospel, expanded it, and then added Acts to it.
Yeah, and he's saying that. I agree with you. Acts is definitely a tendentious sequel. Like it's specifically written to follow the Gospel of Luke. Even if it wasn't, even if what we know as Luke came much earlier, Acts specifically tries to make it seem like it's the same mindset.
Right.
I haven't heard John's voice on here for a while, but John wrote in the side chat that Price talks about the writer of Luke using Euripides in his book, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man. If you want to come on mic and read that to us, John, you can.
He says he's somewhat drugged.
Yeah, I'm sorry, John. I'm in pain and somewhat drugged too, though, but I'm hanging in there.
Yeah, I'm making it.
Hang in there, bro.
But Wayne, was that idea? Maybe I should limit to this. Was the idea that you gave, which I found interesting, that the author of Acts redacted Luke to make it look like it was by the same author? Is that something that the Acts seminar proposed, or is that something that you came to the conclusion on your own?
I'm going to say that's my own conclusion. I don't recall reading it elsewhere, but I think it's pretty obvious from comparison to what's in the Marcionite version and what's in the Catholic version.
Okay, because I've always keep wondering why is it that everyone keeps assuming, even critical scholars generally seem like they're still assuming that Luke and Acts were written by the same person, and I always just wonder why. Why do they keep?
It's mostly because of the tendentious introductions to each book.
But the prologue to Luke is quite clearly not part of the gospel that the Marcionites had. It's clearly part of the added material.
Okay, good. No, that's helpful. I appreciate it. I guess I should get.
I recommended that book again. Michael Parsons. It's called The Unity of Luke Acts.
Michael Parsons.
Hold on, I'm going to write it down in the sidebar.
Sorry. Leon, summarize Parsons' thesis for us again. I didn't catch what his thesis was and why you bring this book up.
It's not.
Is he arguing against
like
what I'm saying or for what I'm saying?
No, he's just conducting kind of an analysis and giving kind of pros and cons to each. Like if somebody, how do I put this? Like there are certain places where one can argue that a similar mind or a similar author is responsible for the material, but there are places, like you just pointed out, one where there's evidence that like I said, it's a tendentious addition to it. And the obvious one that you pointed out is the introduction that was not in Marcion.
Yeah.
But it's a really short book, and it's not that short, but it's a pretty short book, and it just basically answers the question that they'll ask: why do people think that Luke and Acts were the same?
Yeah, I don't want to make fun of the translator of this Detering material, but there's one thing that I saw on one page that struck me as just fascinating. I'm assuming it's a typo, but it just seems to be a fascinating typo. There's a sentence in here where it says, in Acts we are told that following his conversion, Paul gored to the Christian church in Damascus.
Yeah, I noticed.
Gored is not a word. I tried looking some obscure dictionaries to see if it's an English word I didn't know. I really think that it meant to say goad, G-O-E-D, as a past tense of go. But the past tense of go should be went. It's like but it's a double mistake there. It's like instead of saying Paul went, they said Paul goed, but then instead of saying Paul goed, they misspelled it and put gored.
Yeah, I did find a couple of typos that are kind of like that, but at least it's you can kind of understand it from the context, so it's not that bad. But yeah, there are a couple of those in there.
I was wondering if I was wrong and it actually was an obscure English word I wasn't familiar with.
Kicking against the goad.
It's not. It's G-O-R-D though here. It's not goad. It's gored. It's like I think the person meant to say G-O-E-D as the past tense of go, which it should be went as the past tense to go. So yeah. I just thought it was funny. It's beside the point of the book, but yeah, I just thought it was funny.
Well, I mean, it's relevant to the book as a translation. There are places where the language, the translation could have been a little bit more precise, I think, but.
Yeah, what Detering says about Acts here is historical certainty could never be found here. The question whether anything at all in the presentation of Acts could have historical value could basically not be answered by a historian who is aware of his responsibility. If one did not want to simply dismiss everything as unhistorical, and one really could not blame someone who reached such a radical conclusion, all that remains is the simple statement that we have to do here with an apostle who presumably worked around the middle of the 1st century, who is an important missionary, and who may have died in Rome. So that's probably the most charitable you can be with the Book of Acts, according to him.
Yeah, exactly. That's the most historical you can get.
By the way, the title of that book is Rethinking the Unity of Luke and Acts. It's by Michael. It's Mikeal. That explains why I couldn't find it in the normal Michael way of spelling Michael.
Oh, okay, that makes more sense. Rethinking that. The title, the unity of Luke Acts, makes it sound like it's a defense of the fact.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what confused me about you guys bringing it
Yeah,
up.
thank you, and I'm sorry. I kind of got the title a little bit off, but yeah, it's been some years since I read it.
I'm just scanning through my PDF for places I've highlighted. You guys can do the same thing and bring something up now if you like.
I have to remember to highlight stuff. I didn't highlight anything this time around, and I think it has to do because I read it a long time ago, I kind of didn't bother to highlight anything.
I highlighted so many things in my Kindle that there's no way to. It'll take a long time to go through them all.
Yeah. Okay. Detering is talking about a lot of books being pseudepigraphy, or being written in the names of other people. And he talks about the most important reason ancient writers provided their productions with false authorial attributions, which probably that in this way they could invest them with greater authority. In a very conservative society like that in antiquity, which had especially high esteem for traditions and values from ancient times, a writing stemming from ancient times, and moreover one that had been written by a legendary, mythically elevated figure, would naturally have great importance. That seems reasonable, but one thing that struck me about that is if a society really valued ancient texts and stuff, you'd think they'd, at the same time, then as an extension of that, have much more care and caution to not let forgeries, steal their attention. The more valuable something is, the less you want it stolen.
Yeah, and that kind of thinking also makes me kind of question. It's like, if that's the case, why is it that the Pauline corpus, nobody had heard about it at all until Marcion?
Yeah, I don't know what to make of that.
Yeah, that's really strange to me. It's like if here's somebody who's so important that these books would actually make it to a canonized Holy Writ kind of status, and nobody's heard of this, not even Justin.
Yeah, I think there's something else going on here, rather than these books being written in the name of some famous figure. I don't know what else.
This is where we come in and discuss.
Well, I did think it was interesting that Detering, when he comments on the opening claim of authorship as Paul, that that these introductions of the different Pauline letters are different from the type of greetings that you would see in a Greek or Roman letter at the time. He says that they were generally unpretentious, that they would, like he quotes Cicero just saying, Cicero, greetings, Atticus. Like, just very simple. He doesn't, like, praise himself as Paul does, where he says, Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, or, prisoner for the sake of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, one point that Detering...
Yeah, and he goes convoluted. Sorry, go on.
One point that Detering makes is that the way Paul talks about himself a lot sounds more like somebody else talking about Paul and trying to boost him up.
Yeah.
And I'm getting an echo, like somebody's not muting their mic when I'm talking, and then my voice is reverbing back through. Or somebody's not using headphones.
I'm not using headphones, but every once in a while.
That's why then, yeah. That's why.
Okay. It's actually hard for me to talk when I hear my own verse echoing in the headphones. It confuses me when I'm talking.
But yeah, I think Detering does point out, I think that's a good point to make, the fact that that the opening greetings in the Pauline letters are so convoluted and so like vainglorious, let's call it.
Not just the intros, though. I mean, all through the Pauline writings, there's boastings.
Yeah, all these boastings and stuff. It's really good evidence that somebody's talking about Paul rather than Paul talking about himself.
So we were trying to talk at the same time a moment ago. Did everybody get their word in? Did Dale have something else you wanted to say?
I was just looking for things. I didn't have something ready.
Okay. I thought I might have accidentally interrupted you and wanted to give you a chance to fill in.
Particularly, I find when Detering starts getting into examples like this of why he thinks there are indications in the letters that there's, that even the so-called recognized authentic letters were not written by Paul himself. I found those especially interesting. Those are the questions I really wanted to know, like what makes him come to that conclusion. And I've heard Dr. Price mention this one at the end of Galatians where he says, "See with what large letters I am writing in my own hand." And he mentions how 2 Thessalonians does this where he says, "I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. This is the mark in every letter of mine. It's the way that I write." And he's saying most exegetes recognize that as an indication that it was written by someone else. And he's saying they should apply the same thing to Galatians with that.
Exactly. And he sees a double standard there, yes. Actually, give me 1 minute. I'll be right back.
Yeah. Actually, I need to go for a moment also. I'll be right back. Let Leon know that I stepped out.
No problem. Any thoughts about this book, Reuven or John? Are you leaning in the idea that all the letters of Paul are really all written by somebody else? So Reuven says, yeah, interesting. You're back, Leon. Leon Wayne also went just now. He'll be back.
Okay.
But I asked Reuven, and he said that I just wanted to know what he thought about the Pauline letters, and he does believe that there's no genuine Pauline letter.
Yeah, I think I agree with Detering, or at least I'm willing to follow him in his arguments, and I think he's generally correct. If every one of his arguments is exactly on the mark, I don't know about that, but I think he's generally correct.
Just as background before not getting too far into Dettering's work, just talking about him being kind of radical and on the fringe. Earl Doherty is also considered kind of radical and on the fringe. Now, Earl Doherty is one of the more popular writers recently, next to Richard Carrier, to be arguing that Jesus himself was not historical, and started out as a mythological being, basically. But Earl Doherty does not accept Detering's idea of the Pauline epistles being, all forgeries. Doherty is pretty strong in his acceptance of some of the Pauline epistles as being genuine, and written early, before the Gospels.
Yeah, and that's also the case with Richard Carrier. I should point out, as a matter of fact, one of the things that I wanted to challenge him on, but I didn't, but I will in the future.
Yeah.
Was this very question of why so easily accept the 7 letters it's genuine. Yeah. And he gave a really quick answer saying that it was that his opinion was based on internal evidence, and I meant to ask him what internal evidence he specifically meant, but I haven't gotten around to it.
But I know that Earl Doherty is very familiar with the Dutch radical critics, and a lot of his comments regarding the lack of an historical Jesus comes from their observations. So he's accepting what they say about there not being an historical Jesus at the same time that he's rejecting what they say about there not being an historical Paul.
Right, which I think is kind of strange, but that's okay with me. But I think that part of the answer to the question, Wayne, is that I think that their theories, and by their I mean Doherty and Carrier, to some extent depend on their dating of the epistles and of Hebrews for it to make more sense.
Yeah, I can agree with that in a way.
Yeah.
But like I said, I'm still agnostic on whether the Pauline epistles are genuine or not. I mean, I'm probably leaning to Carrier and Doherty's stance, not against Detering, but we'll see if Detering convinces me reading this text.
I think I'm a mythicist in the sense of Carrier and Doherty, but I'm the exact opposite. I think that it's one of the places where I disagree with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all good. It gives us a more interesting, to balance, to argue against each other. Reading the rest of this book. So, did Paul have a secretary? One of the ways to try to explain why these Pauline epistles have different writing styles, and the differences of writing styles is one of the reasons for thinking some are authentic while others are forgeries. But if Paul had a secretary that wrote some of these for him, that would explain the differences in writing style. So why doesn't Detering accept that?
Wait, can you repeat that?
Well, an attempt has been made to explain the linguistic stylistic differences by the hypothesis of a secretary. It is said that Paul did not write the letters himself, but only sketched out a rough draft and gave this to a secretary, who then filled in the details and formulated the wording. And that's used as, by apologists to try to explain why some of these epistles that are claimed to be forgeries could still come by the same author, even though they have different writing styles.
Well, I mean, the use of an amanuensis was pretty common, but I think that what he's talking about is stylistically. I don't think that an amanuensis would have either the liberty or the desire to change someone's style, really.
You might give a rough draft to your idea, and let the person, write it out. So they might use some different vocabulary and things. So, explaining why some of these letters have different vocabulary from the others could come from that. Why some have longer or shorter sentences than others, as for the typical sentence length, could be explained by having a secretary write it for them. But Detering argues here that there's reasons not to think that, because there are theological differences
that's the point.
That a secretary would not really get away with. The writing style, it could explain that, but it can't explain the theological differences.
Letter to my secretary, and I say, okay, read it back to me, and she's saying, or he or she is saying something that completely I disagree with theologically.
Yeah.
That would not fly.
Yeah. And some of the examples that Detering gives, while for the writer of the presumably authentic letters, faith is understood understood primarily as an act, in the pastoral epistles, the focus is primarily on content, i.e., orthodoxy with regard to fundamental, uncompromising apostolic teaching that must be accepted and held fast. And then why the opposition between sarx and pneuma, flesh and spirit, is fundamental for the authentic Paul. These are nowhere referred to in the pastoral epistles. Finally, the theology of the law and works occupies a far more important place in the pastoral epistles than in other Pauline letters, which, in their original stratum, I like that he gives, he mentions there's interpolations in them, are clearly antinomian, and in which all legalistic elements were introduced later.
So how did we get back to the pastorals, though?
Because I was just looking at what I highlighted in Detering. And
okay, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Page 32.
That's cool.
Yeah.
John said he skipped over the section to do with the pastorals because he thought that was a slam dunk already.
Yeah,
I think only the most conservative of apologists would consider the pastorals to be authentic.
Yeah. I was just trying to fill stuff in for listeners on YouTube through this Hangout later, to letting them know what Detering talks about in this chapter. I mean, we don't want to just skip over the stuff that's obvious to us that people watching the video later, would benefit from.
Actually, I appreciate that because sometimes I think I lose sight of the fact that it's not just us.
Yeah.
All right. So what are we up to now?
Yep. Well, I'm looking at my highlighting, and on page 36, Detering says, the Christ hymn in Philippians 2:6 and following, for example, contains strong echoes of the conception of the descent of the heavenly Sophia, which is first evident only in the 2nd century, and fully developed first by the Gnostic Valentinus. For Valentinus, see below, Marcionism and Gnosis. I just wanted to mention out that has he read Margaret Barker?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Inside joke there, but yeah, Margaret Barker would argue that it didn't start with Valentinus.
And I think anyone who knows the Old Testament concept of wisdom, I mean, there's a wisdom literature, that obviously the Gnostics didn't invent. So I think anybody, I think it's only reasonable to say that the Gnostics took an idea and went with it. Whether they had the same idea or not is another story, but they certainly didn't invent the concept of wisdom, as a deity,
Yeah, I don't buy this particular argument as a good one for Philippians being, a 2nd century writing. I think that Christ hymn could be very early on, and there's nothing odd about it being early.
Right.
Well, it could be, but I mean, I think is he arguing that? Well, I mean, yeah. Barker shows that it preceded Valentinus. I
think
guess.
she would say they both draw on the same tradition, but she certainly would think that Philippians 1 and I think Romans 1 are these early Christian creeds in a sense. She would say, just like Bart Ehrman says, and so she would say they definitely precede the Gnostics.
Yeah, I have no problems with that passage in Philippians 2 being a 1st century writing. I know nothing in the passage itself that would make that anachronistic.
In fact, generally speaking, scholars would say those specific texts, Paul's quoting them, or whoever wrote these Pauline letters are quoting an earlier belief of the church that preceded Paul. It's that early.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, the problem that I have with that is that it shows such a high level of Christology that I have a problem believing that it's that early.
It does go against the traditional view of a developing doctrine, but Bart Ehrman, in his How Jesus Became God, this is the sort of text that actually made him change his view finally, and saying that a high Christology came very early. And of course, that goes hand in hand with Margaret Barker's point of view. She has her whole theory is, how is it possible that the church came to this high Christology very early?
Oh yeah, it goes hand in hand. It goes hand in hand with Carrier and Doherty as well. In other words, the first Jesus was a mythical, heavenly being. Yeah.
But it sounds like you disagree with that.
No.
Disagreeing with an early high Christology.
No, I just have a problem with. I'm not. That's not the problem for me. The problem is the traditional dating, how we put these books together one in front of the other. There's a problem there. Like if Marx, this is kind of like irrelevant, but I'll just go into it. If Mark has almost no Christology or very little Christology, and Paul's Christology is that high, I guess it's an argument for mythicism, I think, and it can't be anything else but an argument for mythicism. That the way that the Christology, quote unquote, evolved.
Yeah, my point is I don't really follow Detering in using it as evidence that Philippians is late, or that Philippians is not authentically Pauline.
It's not that clear cut to me, but I don't see like the Sophia thinking. I guess I could go either way on this. It's not that important.
Yeah, my point is I don't follow why Detering brought it up. Basically, page 36 of the PDF here. I don't see what Dettering's getting at with that. Or I see what he's getting at, but I don't follow his argument for it. I mean, on being derivative of Valentinus, basically. I was hoping somebody else would bring up highlights from this to talk about, and not just me.
I was looking for things before Wayne. I just can't find out where I can't. It's harder for me to find out where I highlighted them.
I have to say, this is the second time I read this book. It's been several years, and I'm really enjoying it. And I'm going to make a point to do highlighting from now on because I think it's important.
Yeah. So something else that I'll quote from Detering. Especially characteristic of Ephesians is the letter's lack of situation. Its occasion is nowhere clearly visible. It seems to have been written in historical no man's land. Now, I don't know what to make of that. I'm not sure I agree with that assessment or not. So can you guys persuade me that Dettering's assessment of Ephesians is correct, that it has no obvious, Sitz and Lieben?
I think my painkiller just kicked in, and I didn't get most of what you just said.
I think I've read that too before. That is it Ephesians, Wayne?
Yeah, he's talking about Ephesians here.
He's saying that basically Ephesians doesn't have a clear setting, and I've heard it said. I think sometimes people think that it was like a letter to the Laodiceans. Like it's not specific enough. It's almost like a general letter. Is that what you're saying, kind of?
Detering says that the letter of the Laodiceans was more likely Colossians, I believe.
Ah, okay, sorry.
I could be wrong though, but I mean I follow your thinking though, and this is something that I'm familiar with. That Ephesians and Colossians are almost duplicates of each other in that sense.
That's something else that Detering talks about, is some of the epistles being, copies of other epistles with bits added. Like 2 Thessalonians, I think he claims is, copies tons from 1 Thessalonians.
Right. Yeah, and that's why they called it 2 Thessalonians. It's almost like the same type of. It's 2 Thessalonians is to 1 Thessalonians what Acts is to Luke in a way.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. If 2 Thessalonians was meant to replace rather than supplement 1 Thessalonians, but somehow 1 Thessalonians got kept in the canon.
By the way, one thing that I see that I wanted to mention is he makes an interesting comment. I'm looking at the Kindle now, so I could only tell you it's a 23%. I can't tell what page it's on, but he says, why does Paul undergo a battle with beasts in Ephesus? This is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:32. It says, even though as supposedly a Roman citizen, he could not be sentenced to such an experience. He says, even if he was not a citizen of Rome, how could he have survived such a thing? But does Paul, so the last question, of course, he claims that he faced beasts in the arena, basically, and he's saying he survived, so that's a question. Obviously, it seems to me a claim for a miracle, but that's another issue. But the question of if he's really a Roman citizen and he would never have been subjected to that, does Paul ever make the claim in his letters of being a Roman citizen, or is that only something that he claims in Acts?
I'd have to look it up.
Because he does claim it in Acts.
Yeah, I have to look it up. I don't know. But yeah, and anyway, I always forget this. I always have to double check. But yeah, the book of Ephesians in the Catholic Bible, in the modern Bible we have now, is an expansion of the text that was labeled as to the Laodiceans in Marcion's canon. I mean, that's not controversial at all. And we know in Marcion's canon it was addressed to the Laodiceans, and we know that Ephesians is a longer version of it. But Detering makes this claim for a couple of the epistles that they lack situation. They have no clear setting, and I just don't know what to make of that. Should I agree with Detering about that, or is that something that should be questioned? He also mentions that the writer of Ephesians hardly seems to have had a personal relationship with the Christians addressed there. Like, he's talking like the people don't really know him personally, and yet, according to Acts, he spent lots of time in Ephesus.
Right, exactly, and that's actually a really good point that was made by Walter Bauer in his 34 book, and that's one of the main arguments that really changed my mind about the whole thing. Bauer really moved me on this. It's like, wait a minute, so Paul was the man in Ephesus, but then only a couple of decades later, no one has heard of him. What the hell's going on here?
Yeah, and the letters look like they're written to the entire church, not to a particular community.
Oh, they don't look like they're addressing any specific local issues in that city?
Right. That's what Detering is saying, and I think I agree.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I agree. I really have to reread all the Pauline epistles and think, with each of these questions in mind,
Some are clearly, I mean,
when you think about it, it's like the fact that there's a discrepancy and we don't know who the letter of the Laodiceans exactly were is kind of reflected in the fact that it's not so clear in Colossians or in Ephesians. I'm sorry.
I mean, that may be the case in some of the letters, but some of the letters clearly have a local situation. This is so obvious, I think. I mean, I grew up as a Christian.
Yeah,
but you see it in the letters. What's that?
But not Ephesians.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. But I'm thinking of Corinthians specifically as, it's often...
Oh, I know, yeah.
It's often said Paul's, he's dealing with different... Like, he's arguing with this point that they brought up, and then this point, and then this point. It's like you're hearing one side of a phone call. You have to put together a whole conversation. It's clearly addressing something unique. So I agree. In some letters, there's not, but you can't say that about all the Pauline letters. That some of them clearly have a local situation that he's addressing. In several, not the general church.
I think you're correct. We're just talking about Ephesians.
Okay.
There's also an issue in that the letters make it sound like these churches have existed for a very long time. And people, like Detering takes that as evidence that these are written like in the 2nd century, when the churches have existed for a long time. The question I kind of want to float is, I mean, what is the earliest we could imagine these churches actually having been started? I mean, under the standard, fundamentalist Christian doctrines and stuff, they couldn't have started earlier than 30 AD, time of the crucifixion. I mean, the churches didn't exist before then. But if we take, the crucifixion itself as being mythical and stuff, and not, the beginning of these churches, I don't find it implausible that Christian churches could have existed, even 50 BC.
Oh, sure.
I mean, that's not out of the question here. But there's also, the possibility that, these churches all started, after the destruction of Jerusalem, as things spread out. So, that 70 is the earliest. So, if they're talking about these churches being old, then how many years after 70 could they have existed? So, what should we take as the oldest, time plausibly that these churches could have been, that explains them, being established, at the time these letters are written?
Well, I think that the latest it could be, or whatever. Detering talks about it's implied that the temple is already destroyed. In which letter was it? Was it Romans? I think it was in Romans.
Actually,
I should have.
I'm looking at what he's saying there. He says, why does the author who presumably wrote 1 Thessalonians between 50 and 60 look back upon the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE? And then he quotes 1 Thessalonians 2:16, God's judgment has come upon them, that is the Jews, at last.
So it was, thank you. I stand corrected. It was Thessalonians.
But then he also says, compare also Israel's rejection in Romans 11:15 and the severity of God in 11:22. So he thinks that those parts of Romans are also talking about a already accomplished destruction of Jerusalem.
Right, and that could not have, so it could not have been written in the 50s.
Right, exactly. By the way, speaking of that, the very next paragraph after that, he says, for the persecutions of Christians of which mention is made again and again in the Pauline epistles, in Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, he says there is no evidence before Nero. So he thinks that's again another indication that these are letters that have been written later when persecutions become a common thing.
Yeah, I think little things like that. I think it's a cumulative case that he's making, and I generally accept it. I think these are all really valid questions.
I guess what I want to ask is the observation correct that the letters seem to be addressed to churches that appeared to have been around for for many generations, or do they appear to be written to churches that are all recently established?
There's one point in Detering, and I should have highlighted it again, where he seems to think that at least one of them is looking backward, that it has existed for a while.
I know that's true of the pastoral epistles, but I'm not sure about the others.
He does make a case that I'm not sure which one, but where it's referring to it's not referring. It's making use of language, which makes it seem like this is not recent. This is something that has been established for a while.
And how long would a while need to be?
Well, I mean,
4 years or 2 or 3 generations.
At that point, it becomes kind of arbitrary. We don't know, and that's cool. I'm okay with we don't know.
Yeah. So basically, the fact that some of these passages seem to be talking to established churches doesn't really work as an argument for them being late. You know, for the epistles being late.
Let me think about that. I mean, the epistles being late, but the community being existent for a long time.
What are the examples that you've given of the idea that these churches have existed for a while now, as opposed to Paul planting them and knowing the people because of that? He converted them.
Right.
He's their father in that sense, you know, and he's cares for them as a child, you know.
Right.
He was pregnant with them. But you're saying that there's evidence in the text, these letters, that they existed for quite a long time, have a long.
No. I'm not really stressing any of this. I just kind of vaguely remember him making a point about that.
Oh, okay.
It's not something that I'm stressing.
Yeah, I'm asking about it because I'm not sure where it comes from. I'm not sure what verses that are being used to get this idea from, and I'm not sure it's true that any of these epistles, you know, appear to be written to a church that has been established for a long time.
I'd like to make a point here. I'd like to make a point that to make a little bit of a meta comment about, in comparison to the book we read, Margaret Barker, who meticulously cited like thousands of individual verses. If there's a criticism that I have of the Detering book, is he doesn't do that very much. He kind of makes his case and he makes one or two examples and then he moves on.
Yeah, he makes some assertions that I'm not sure if I can agree with without having to reread the epistles in their entirety.
Right, and I guess there's somewhere in the middle would have been an ideal writer, because Margaret, I think Barker was too much. She gave us too much.
By the
and
way,
he's kind of.
Go ahead.
Go on, Dale.
I didn't want to get away from your point, but definitely that point well taken, that she goes to one extreme and he goes to the other extreme. But yeah. I do want to. There's two more items that I see on this one page that I find interesting. One is a criticism of Romans as being authentic, and the other of Galatians. He says one is on the Romans. He says, "Is it conceivable that on the very eve of his sojourn in Rome, he wrote one of the longest letters in ancient literature to the church there? Why does he write a letter at all that goes beyond a brief announcement of his coming? Why would he not be able to, in a short time to provide a much better and more lively testimony through his personal presence with the Roman community?" So yeah, if you're going to go there, why go at this great length to expound on your theology, the greatest expression of your theology, before you go there and you have nothing to say? Almost like, why go there then?
especially since he's a stranger to them, why would they care that he's writing a magnum opus?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Doesn't have any weight to them, unless they're suspicious of him, and then he's got to. But again, like he says, I think it's a valid point that if you're going there, you're going to be expounding on. That's the purpose of going there, right?
Yeah, I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's what the letter should have said. I'm really looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I remember the Acts Seminar report referring to that as part of a larger argument for the Book of Acts being fictional. But I forget how that fits in with this, how they argued it.
Also, another point that's right after this, but dealing with Galatians. But this is a psychological point, but it's always seemed weird to me. It says after Paul receives his revelation, Paul says in Galatians 1:17 that he goes into the desert to Arabia and not to the Jerusalem church, and he says that doesn't make psychological sense. But you do wonder about, like, what's the thinking behind that? It doesn't seem natural in any way that the first thing you're converted and then you want to get away from everybody for 3 years, apparently.
Yeah, that makes no sense to me. I agree with that. And I think it shows a very clear contrast between the story of Paul in Acts and the story of Paul in Galatians. That's a contradiction that some people say it's not a contradiction, but I've yet to see it. You know, it hasn't been shown to me. I think that Paul is in Acts. They're trying to fit him into the scheme as one of the apostles. And in the letters, Paul is saying, man, screw those guys. I'm an apostle. You see what I'm saying?
In his letters, he tries to make himself out to be the apostle.
Right.
Not just an apostle, but,
Yeah, but that's my point. That's my point. He's going, man, screw those guys.
Exactly. I don't need them. I don't respect them. It's almost like even if they were taught directly by a historical Jesus, which he doesn't mention, but obviously that's what we get from the Gospels. But even if that's the case, he's not impressed with that. He got something directly from a personal revelation. Although I would suggest that from the perspective of the Christ myth theory, I think Earl Doherty and I think probably Carrier would suggest that any claim to have seen the risen Christ, like Peter's claim and James' claim, that these were all revelations, not a literal physical sighting. And so, if that's the case, then there would be no difference between Paul's revelation and their revelation. Whereas, I guess I'm trying to think of, Paul obviously in his letters seems to think that he has an advantage over the others. And I'm thinking from a Christ myth perspective, there is no real difference between their revelations. Paul saw one and the others saw one, and it's just of the same nature, and so how can you weigh these? Whereas it seems almost like, from the gospel perspective, their claim is of an earthly Jesus. They were trained by the earthly Jesus. Paul was trained by the heavenly Jesus. That's the difference. So in other words, from a Christ myth perspective, and you deny the physical training that they got, then there's no difference anymore. Do you see the problem I'm having? Did I explain that clearly or no?
I'm sorry. I was disrupted. I was focusing on something else and I missed what you said. I apologize.
I'll try to repeat it, but basically, I see Paul as trying to say that he has a superior. You mentioned the kind of text where Paul's looking down on these guys, these Judaizers, these men from James.
Yeah.
And he's saying basically he's the apostle, right? Who cares about these other guys, whoever they think they are? They're nobody compared to him.
Right.
And I get basically the claim that Paul's saying in these letters is, I got my revelation directly from Jesus Christ in a vision, directly from him. All right? And I'm saying the Christ myth people basically are saying, yeah, that's the only thing that Paul can claim is that he had everything he knows about Jesus comes from a visions, right? Visions. But the idea from a Christ myth perspective is Peter and James and anybody else that have claimed to see Jesus, that's all they ever got either, was the same thing that Paul got, a revision, right?
Right.
So in other words, there would be no difference between them. Paul could say is, what they got, I got. But Paul doesn't talk that way. Paul says, what I got is superior to what they got, and it seems to me it fits more in the idea of the gospel tradition, the Orthodox position, which is, you guys saw an earthly Jesus. I saw the heavenly Jesus. That's why my vision is more important than theirs. Theirs wasn't a vision. It came from an earthly Jesus who didn't know any better, in a sense. My vision came from a glorified Jesus who now everything is revealed to him. That's why mine trumps theirs. So it seems to me, from that perspective, the Christ myth theory doesn't make sense with such a text. Do you get that? And maybe you can respond to it.
Right, and I think that's exactly why Acts is trying to subdue Paul's wild streak there. Paul's going rogue.
I want to address something in the side chat. Somebody came into the room and wrote that he can tell this isn't really a discussion on the validity of claims, claiming that we're not being critical enough of what Detering is writing. I want to point out that these Hangouts don't address the entire book in one Hangout. I mean, we're doing this over a whole month, over 4 weeks. And part of our methodology is to first understand what the author is saying and to present to the audience, what the author's claims are. And secondary to that, we have our own questions about them. And I have been questioning things in Detering. I mean, he makes sweeping claims about some of these epistles, and I've been asking whether we can actually agree with these sweeping claims.
Yeah, I think the question you're talking about is
the fact of whether Ephesians, has a setting or not. I mean, I'm not sure if I agree with Detering on that. I'd have to reread it.
The person that you're talking about, I think, is being unfair, and I think he has a chip on his shoulder, and let him.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah. I just wanted to address it for the people here, though. It's just like, we're trying to be charitable to the book and explain to people what the book is about. And, whether we personally agree with this book and what we want to criticize in the book is built on that as a second thing. But that progresses as we go through these Hangouts, as we deal with more and more of the book. This is our first Hangout on this book, so it's too soon to have lots of criticisms of it. We have to start out by understanding what the thesis actually is.
I think we've been looking for strengths and weaknesses wherever we see them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have also. I think that this person is being disruptive.
Yeah. I know. I just wanted to address that in case anybody else listening to this on YouTube has similar views.
By the way, John, you say that you and Doug refuted my interpretation utterly. Are you just joking, or did you actually? Did we talk about this before? We may have talked about the Christ myth theory before, but on this particular issue that I bring up, did we ever discuss it?
I did? Yeah, and I think that it was in a chat or something. It wasn't like in a Hangout. But I think Doug and I were trying to say that, geez, I can't really even think of it now. Sorry. But anyway, we had disagreed with you on the interpretation that you presented just a moment ago about Paul presenting his viewpoint as being superior or something. I can't remember now. Sorry. I'm a lot of it.
So you don't think that Paul considers his gospel as superior to the gospel of the Jewish church?
I don't. I think he's desperately trying to be included in the opinion, the majority opinion. He doesn't think his is superior. I think he's claiming that his is at least as important.
I see. So in other words, they can't look down on me because I'm as good as them?
Right.
Yeah, it had something to do with the nature of what they were claiming. The mythicist point of view seems to favor that they were having visions as well. So there was no difference between Paul's calling and the Jerusalem, the pillars,
Yeah, I see no claim in Paul's, in the quotation from Paul there, that the other pillars, have seen, Jesus in a different way than he has. I don't see a claim that they saw the physical Jesus and I saw the spiritual Jesus. That makes my revelation better. I just don't see the first half of that represented.
I guess
the idea that both saw the spiritual Jesus makes more sense to me.
Well, I guess I'm getting that from like Galatians, for example, where Paul's saying that if he actually doesn't want them to go back or be fooled. That's my impression, right? To be fooled by these men who come from James.
Wait, hold on. I don't think you can say that Galatians, Paul, we can't say who those Judaizers were. I don't think you can demonstrate that they came from James. You can say that they were Judaizers, but you can't say that they came from James. When James comes up in Galatians, it has to do with looking back at the council, looking back at discussions that dispute that he had with James. But the Judaizers themselves that he's addressing, that the letter address or that it talks about in the beginning, we don't know who those people were. I don't think we can safely say that they were from James.
All right, so you don't think that, because when he speaks about people, who are teaching another gospel.
Judaizers.
And he says, anyone who's teaching another gospel, let him be accursed, even if an angel of God. You don't think he's addressing or confronting the Jerusalem church and James and Peter.
I don't think that we can say that that's who it is. I'm saying that.
Because I have been thinking that, as you could probably tell.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. This is like the second or third time you bring it up, and so I kind of wanted to speak up.
Okay, sometimes I don't know what I've repeated. I apologize, but actually, it works in my favor if you're addressing it.
Yeah. But I actually wrote about this some time ago, which is kind of why it's fresh, kind of on my mind. There's nowhere in the letter that tells us that that community that he's calling accursed at anathema is James. I think I'm correct in that. I mean, we can discuss it. We can read it and discuss it in some Hangout or something if you want to.
Going back to Detering, regarding 2 Thessalonians, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I'm trying to follow through what I highlighted in here. Did Paul copy from himself? And then he refers to the fact that apart from chapter 2, 2 through 9, and 11 through 12, there are only 9 verses in 2 Thessalonians without parallels in 1 Thessalonians. And he argues from that the 2 Thessalonians could not have been by the same author, that it was somebody else, copying Paul to make a new letter.
I don't think that's a strong case. I think it's a weak case, but I think I kind of more or less agree with it, but I don't think it's that strong of a case, because, I could see an author copying himself, but not to such a degree.
And there's some apologetic arguments that the 2 letters copy because they're meant for, one's meant for just the leaders of the churches, and the others are meant for the churches themselves, or to different audiences in a way. And was there a Pauline school? I mean, are these different letters all coming from students of Paul?
When scholars speak of a Pauline school, I've never understood.
Students of Paul. Sorry.
Yeah, I've never exactly, he actually seems to literally picture a school that existed, like the school in Athens. I never pictured that. I always thought he's referring to people that are in churches that he planted, that agree with his theology. So if Paul planted the church in Corinth, and they followed his theology, then the letter originated with someone in one of those churches, That's right. That's a Pauline school,
Right, but the problem I have with that concept, though, is that I don't think there's such a thing as a monolithic Pauline theology. I think they're like we said when Moll was actually hanging out with us. He's exploring the possibility that there may have been 2 or 3 Pauls. You dig what I'm saying? Like, theologically speaking.
Right.
And so, like, for instance, when he talks to the Corinthians, the concerns that he has with their theology and their liturgies is not the same concerns that he has with the theologies and liturgies of the Romans, for instance. And so I don't think it can be said that there's such a thing as a Pauline school.
What Detering writes is, in the same way as the assumption of a Johannine school, it represents a fiction, a pure hypothesis for which not the slightest basis can be found in the New Testament. So he's basically saying that there's no discussion of the existence of the school anywhere in the texts.
Sure, yeah.
So why should we posit the school to explain these texts?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Just pulling something out of their butt.
Yeah, it's only there to salvage orthodoxy.
But don't you think he's reading the idea of a school too literally? I can't see how scholars. I can't see that.
No, I don't.
Scholars think of a Pauline school or
I don't, because
they think of it in the way that Detering. I think he's. It's a red herring in a sense. He's trying to. This is not the way they use the term. he's saying just because you've never seen a Johannine school and no early church historian ever refers to a Johannine or a Pauline school, so it didn't exist, and they would have known about it. So he's taking this so literally, but that's not the way scholars refer to it. That's not what they're talking about.
I see your point.
Johannine churches and Pauline churches existed. That is, these churches that shared the Gospel of John's theology, they existed. And this is where this theology comes from. You know, that's all it's saying.
Well, I see your point. I see your point regarding Detering and the Johannine school, but I'm gonna repeat that I don't think the same kind of school, quote unquote, even if it's not literal and just a general mindset, and kind of a school use of the word school.
But all you're saying, Leon, as far as I can see, all you're saying is that in the Pauline letters you see, like you even mentioned, somebody who said that there's 3 schools. So even if you see a variety of theologies in the letters, when I say that scholars are referring to a Pauline, when I say that scholars refer to a Pauline school, they're talking about whichever churches that Paul actually planted on the basis that a real Paul existed and he really planted churches and he taught them his theology, then these are genuine, the Pauline school. That's what we're talking about there. The influence of those churches has to have Paul's genuine theology, a single theology. You can identify different theologies in the letters, but...
I completely agree with you. I think that if Paul had founded churches, that completely would be the case. The fact that the Pauline epistles claim to have founded churches is a problem, however.
All right, but do you see the point that when Detering says, there's no knowledge of an existing school, and these early church fathers would have mentioned it if there was such a school.
No, yeah, I don't think
churches. Then he takes it as a literal school. He's crazy. Nobody's talking that way.
I would agree with you on that. I'd note your point on that, but I think I think it's kind of it's a weak argument. I agree with you. Yes. But nevertheless, I don't see such a thing as the Pauline school. I don't think. Well, never. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
I guess it's
I think that the term school has a specific meaning. Like, okay, certain individuals within a circle, or direct philosophical descendants. You might say.
When I read Galatians, and when I read Corinthians, and when I read Romans, I don't see a monolithic theology or a monolithic liturgy there. Do you follow me? And so I don't see it as a Pauline school.
Right. Although it's
even so, it could still be, the descendants of somebody, as far as those who are looking to a person as their authority. In that sense, a school, they can be their thinking can be widely different from their founders. It could evolve or change over time.
Yeah, that's possible too.
By the way, Reuven, even though Reuven's made the comment that he doesn't think that there's any genuine Pauline letters, he does believe that the big 4, Romans, Galatians, and 1st and 2nd Corinthians, were all written by the same person. So if you see a distinction in the theology between Romans and Corinthians, for example,
right,
then you've got to deal with, are we talking about, is it a single author? And if it is, then how are you seeing these different theologies? Maybe there's some interpolation going on, or a redactor's work that entered some, differences.
Yeah, I disagree with Reuven on that. I don't see a single author in the big 4.
And Wayne and I, we talked about this earlier on. The very existence of interpolations muddies the water when it comes to seeing unity.
Oh,
like a single theology of Paul, and you say you don't see it. Well, that could rest on the interpolation, redactor's work.
Yeah, I think a lot of good scholarship on the New Testament, otherwise good scholarship, is rendered useless from their lack of attention to what's interpolation and what's not.
I agree.
And I think that's a serious problem in New Testament scholarship.
I completely agree.
And I'm hoping books like, Badun's The First New Testament and stuff could help, change that. I'm hoping.
It isn't the issue with interpolations, basically, okay, unless you have some manuscript evidence that there's, earlier versions without something that otherwise there's no other case except subjectivity upon which to say what is interpolated and what isn't.
But that's not the case, though. We have, pretty good evidence for what the Marcionite versions of these documents had in them, and we have, clear evidence that it's different from what's in the Catholic versions, and the differences kind of seem to be a systematic adding to the text from the in the Catholic versions. So all of those texts, the differences between the Catholic and Marcionite versions has to be addressed in the overall argument. And scholars who don't do that, scholars who try to comment, on Pauline theology and stuff, that don't take into account what's in the Marcionite versions and what's not, I think that lack of doing that can render their whole scholarship useless, even if they make good observations on other issues.
Well, the big problem also there is what we know, or we think we know what was in Marcion, is based on church fathers, and there's still a debate about which church fathers you can. For instance, the Dialogues of Adamantius, I believe.
Yes.
A lot of scholars would totally reject that as being of any use. Maybe Tertullian and a few others. Epiphanius, hey, and so there's still a debate of whether there's even priority of Marcion to the canon. Still. Yeah. It's not a slam dunk either. So you're never going to get scholars to come to a consensus about interpolations if you can't even agree on that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. But as one who's convinced that the Marcionite version was original, I think people who try to argue about the characteristics of the epistles, treating the interpolations and the original text on equal ground, that muddies their argument so much that it makes it impossible for me to follow or agree with.
That's actually a good point to make, Wayne and John. It's kind of like we're dealing with all of these hypotheses that are interdependent with each other, and if you change one thing in one, then it means something else for another. And it's one of the things that I find fascinating about studying this stuff. It's like everything is built on there's no solid foundation for any of it. It's all relative to each fact is relative to something else that we take for granted, that we presuppose.
Oh, let's just call it quits.
No, I enjoy it, man. I really, really dig it. Although sometimes I tell myself to call it quits, but for different reasons. But yeah.
I want to read something else from Detering here that I'd like to talk about a bit. This is off of the PDF, page 42. Many people perhaps believe that the existence of inauthentic letters necessarily has the simultaneous presence of authentic letters as a presupposition, but the former belongs to the latter almost like a shadow, and thus necessarily presupposes it. They think that if there had not been an Apostle Paul who left behind authentic letters, no later person would have come up with the idea of writing letters under his name. And myself, that actually does seem plausible there. That seems like the default position. But Detering goes on to say, this assumption, however, is not persuasive. One can easily imagine that not only the writers of the pastoral epistles, the Deutero-Pauline letters, and 2 Thessalonians, but also the writers of the rest of the Pauline letters possess from tradition only the report of the life and work of the apostle, and that the whole fiction of an apostle who wrote letters, who as we will see, the writer of Acts knew nothing at all about, or even wanted to know about, was their own invention. But I'm not sure myself whether I can follow Detering on. So, I mean, I think the original part of the quote, and when people think, that you're not going to have forgeries unless there's something you're trying to, imitate. You're not going to have counterfeits unless there's an original to be counterfeited. I kind of agree with that thinking.
So do I. Although I did like the fact that he at least had to posit, because he doesn't believe that Paul even existed. Not let alone he's not just making the case that none of these letters are genuine to Paul. He's saying there never was a Paul, and so obviously in your mind, there would have to be a Paul for you to want to create letters and attribute it to, because this guy obviously had a reputation. He had some authority that the author is appealing to. But as he says, if there was a tradition, there at least would have had to been a tradition about him, even if he didn't exist. I agree that at least that there had to be something like that. Although I tend not to think that that's sufficient. That there had to be some guy to result in the tradition in the church, I don't see another example. Well, unless you say Jesus is the other example. From the Christ myth perspective,
So I'd like to know what Leon thinks about this idea.
Yeah, I'm just distracted by Reuven, and I'm trying to address him in texting, and whenever I'm writing, I don't hear what you guys are saying, and I have a problem with that. I think that I'm going to address Reuven just briefly. Reuven, I'm basing it on my own reading of these four. I see differences there, and I don't know. Some are surely interpolations, some not be. That has to be argued. I don't just accept it as a consensus. And now, Wayne, what were you asking me?
Do you want to read that section again, Wayne?
I'll reread it again for Leon, yeah. This is from page 42 in the PDF. Many people perhaps believe that the existence of inauthentic letters necessarily has the simultaneous presence of authentic letters as a presupposition, that the former belongs to the latter almost like a shadow, and thus necessarily presupposes it. They think that if there had not been an Apostle Paul who left behind authentic letters, no later person would have come up with the idea of writing letters under the name of Paul.
Right, I remember reading that. Yeah, and this is kind of tangentially related to what we're talking about with Reuven here.
But I kind of agree with the statement I just read, which is a statement that Detering is arguing against. He goes on to say this assumption, however, is not persuasive.
Yeah, I don't think that it logically follows. In other words, if the interpolations, because there are interpolations, doesn't necessarily mean that the original was authentic.
No, we're not talking about interpolations. We're talking about pseudepigrapha, written in a certain person's name. That there would have had to have been, other things in that, the person would have had to have been known for things, for there to be a motivation for the pseudepigrapha.
Yeah, but I mean, couldn't the existence of the literature by itself be a motivation? Would it have to be the existence of the person? I mean,
what literature?
He's saying, in other words, before there was any literature, somebody had to have the desire to create literature and attribute it to this guy. Why would they if the guy didn't exist and he had no authority in the church? He had to have had such an authority in the church already for them to want to create the literature in his name.
I get that, but I don't think that logically follows from what we know. In other words, Aesop's fables. Why would somebody attribute something to O. Henry? Why would somebody attribute something to? Are you following me?
No.
It doesn't necessarily mean that there must have been a historical person behind it.
I have to admit my ignorance in not knowing who O. Henry is. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's just a folkloric folkloric tales that are all attributed to one individual.
Okay.
But it turns out that there probably was never such a person.
Well, that comes from having a collection of stories and wanting to unify them at a later stage. Right. I don't think it's what we have here in the case of the epistles of Paul, though. The argument here is that we have fake epistles in Paul's name because Paul became famous writing legitimate epistles.
Right, but I think it's kind of like the cargo cults. John Frum wasn't really anybody, and I realize that we're talking about text here. We're not talking about just folklore. But
so you're thinking there's a lot of these individual texts that weren't in the name of Paul, then only after they were collected, Paul's name was put on them?
No, I think that at some point during the early 2nd century, somebody invented somebody named Paul who lived in the 50s of the 1st century.
Is that what Detering is arguing later?
I'd have to. I guess I'm going to continue reading because it's been a while. That's kind of that's where my head is at, though.
Well, Detering specifically is talking about. He says, and if you're reading it, he said they had reports of the life and work of the Apostle Paul. Now, what is his work? Founding churches, right? So it doesn't take much to make the leap of saying, well, he must have written to those churches. That's what he's saying. You know, all you need is a legend of a person, and then you can make up whatever characteristics they have later on.
And
maybe he was a letter writer, maybe he was a great preacher. You know, it depends.
Yeah, and the fact that Acts has no idea that Paul wrote letters.
Yeah, but he was a preacher. Preached like Peter.
Yeah, according to the Acts seminar, the author of Acts knew that Paul wrote letters and had access to those letters, but intentionally covered up the fact.
Right, and actually, you're about to get to that in the Detering book. He discusses this. That's one of the possibilities. That's one of the possibilities. I think there are 4 or 5. I don't know what page. John, can you help me out? You know what page that when he goes into whether gosh, let me open up my book. Hold on.
Anyway, Detering gives a good definition of authenticity here. I mean, what it would take, for the letters of Paul to be authentic. The letters transmitted under the name of Paul, therefore, can only be regarded as really authentic if it has been shown that they fit seamlessly and unbroken into the time and historical circumstances presupposed by their writer.
Right, of 50s.
Yeah. And then she's arguing that that's not the case for any of them.
That's pretty much what he's arguing, I think, so far. Yeah.
Leon, I can't get away from the idea that whenever I look at the history, if you look at collections of all the pseudepigrapha, Christian pseudepigrapha, as far as I can see, they all are characters that have a tradition of being real people and had, therefore, an authority in the early church, and that's the reason why you have a 1 Peter and a 2 Peter, is because Peter was a recognized figure with authority in the church, and that's why they chose that name.
Sure.
But to invent a character, to write a letter in the name of someone.
Hold on. Let me correct myself. No, they didn't invent a character. They invented an author.
Well, I'm saying pseudepigrapha by its very nature, they're inventing an author. Like 2 Peter, 1 Peter. They're not the author. Presuming there was a Peter, but he didn't write it. Same thing with this idea.
Paul might have been a real individual who might have been a preacher. I'm cool with that. But the fact that in the 2nd century, well, Wayne says that the Acts seminar does their explanation. That's one of 4 different possibilities that Detering offers. That the author or the editor of Acts ignored the letters for whatever reason. That's actually a good point, Reuven, actually, but I don't want to get distracted. I'm not going to look. But I lost it anyway. Sorry. I gotta stop looking at the sidebar.
Yeah, stop. Reuven, either speak up or stop typing. But at least you mentioned the idea that you're open to the idea that there was a historical Paul, because I think that that's a valid point, as Wayne points out also, that it's much more natural to think that if they're going to write a letter like this under Paul's name, it's because there was a Paul with authority in some churches. But one thing that he says, which almost slightly different, as if to write a fabricated letter of Paul would presume that he wrote other letters that you're trying to imitate. That I don't agree with, because, like I say, 1 Peter and 2 Peter are. I don't think Peter ever wrote a letter.
See, that's my point.
Just to fabricate a letter doesn't presume that there was a authentic letter. You know.
You just made my point.
Okay.
Is that the same point Detering was trying to make, or we misconstrued what Detering said?
Actually, you know what? That's a good question, and if I am overstepping Detering, I apologize.
If that's all he wants to say, then that's fine. I think he's going beyond and trying to say there doesn't even need to be a historical Paul for you to try to write a letter in his name. And that, I think, is going too far. I can't agree with that.
Right, yeah, I think you may be right on that. So, yeah, I have a hard... because my problem is, you know, if there really was a person named Paul, I mean, and I'm cool accepting that there was a person named Paul who may have been a famous preacher, but the letters are later than that. The letters, for some reason, someone felt the need to attribute letters to this character. Like Peter. Like James.
Exactly. By the way, I want to apologize to Reuven for saying, I don't want to discourage your writing. I appreciate your comments, but it is hard to. I notice that whenever I want to read the comments on the side, then I miss what's being said, and so it's hard to know how to keep balance these two things.
When the comments on the side are important, they should be read into the Hangout.
Yeah, I agree. Because what happens is I start reading and I start responding to the sidebar, and I'm missing what people are saying in the room.
But I mean, some of what Reuven may write in the side chat is stuff that should be, you know, available to the people listening live.
Reuven, man, speak.
But one of us could read it. I don't want to read it right now because I've been reading so much other stuff. But if you think that something Reuven's writing is important, read it to the Hangout.
I often do, and that's the reason why I focus on his writings more than most, just because I know others could join in if they want, and because Reuven doesn't want to, so that's the only way to vocalize what he's going to say.
Actually, have you ever noticed that Reuven and Doug never speak on the mic together? Do you suppose? No, never mind.
Or are they the same person?
Yeah, not kidding. I'm making a Clark Kent joke.
Yeah, exactly.
So, does Romans chapter 11, I don't have the text of it handy, show very clearly that the writer of the letter cannot be Paul, but someone writing after the destruction of Jerusalem?
Romans what? 11?
Yes.
Hold on. Yeah, do you know what verse it is?
No, Romans, the whole chapter, I guess. I'm just
11:15 and following.
Okay, thank you.
And 11:22, the severity of God. But it speaks about Israel's rejection.
Yeah. I guess.
So your question is this really an expression, or is this really reflecting the fall of Jerusalem having occurred already?
Yeah, I guess. Is it evidence that, you know, the book of Romans wasn't written, you know, mid-first century?
I have this one volume that has 8 different translations, and I'm kind of looking at each one, so give me a second.
So I was just going through things that Detering writes, and there's something I highlighted in that particular talk about Romans 11.
It's not clear at all, though. It's a possible interpretation. I don't even find myself leaning in that direction for Romans. It's certainly not clear.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it's slam dunk, But I could see his interpretation. Because otherwise, I have to ask myself, what other rejection is he talking about? You know?
So I don't have the text in front of me, so can you quote a couple verses from Romans to remind me what the passage says?
Let me see, I'll do, what is it, 13, 14? Let me tell you, I'm going to read it from the Jerusalem Bible. Let me tell you, pagans, this. I have been sent to the pagans as their apostle, and I am proud of being sent, but the purpose of it is to make my own people envious of you, and in this way save some of them, since their rejection meant the reconciliation of the world. Do you know that their admission will mean what their admission will mean? Yeah, it seems to me that if he's not referring to the fall of Jerusalem or the fall, then what is he referring to?
This is popularly known as the doctrine of supersessionism, basically that the church takes the place of the Jews as God's people. But the idea basically is
I know.
those who accept Christ are his people, and those who reject them are not. There's not necessarily a rejection going on. Well, let's say a replacement. There's not, let's say, a replacement theology, but it all centers around the person of Christ. Those who join themselves to Christ are, like he compares it to this one tree, the olive tree, and he says that he lops off branches. Anyone who doesn't hold to Christ, who's the root, is not part of the tree, and so they get lopped off. But even Gentiles, there's a Gentile inclusion, so even they're included if they attach themselves to Christ, and they're part of the true Israel, the Israel of God. And so I think that's Paul's theology. They rejected once they rejected Christ. So at Christ's crucifixion, not at Jerusalem's destruction in 70 A.D.
Yeah, I could see that as an Orthodox interpretation, but I don't think it's that clear.
That's why I'm saying the idea that there's a Jerusalem destruction there is only a possibility. It's not
right. Yeah. It's plausible.
Can you remind me what verses those are?
It's Romans 11. I started reading from 13.
To how long? To where?
Detering specifically cites verse 15 and following through, and then he cites 22 specifically.
Oh, okay. Then I should have
22.
kept reading. Okay. Sorry.
Okay, I'm looking at Jason Badoon's reconstruction of the Apostolicon, and it looks like that passage was not part of the Apostolicon; that's part of the interpolated material.
Oh, interesting. That's interesting.
But it's questionable. Like I said, these patristic references to what was in that Apostolicon and what's not can be vague sometimes.
But I think more convincing to me than those Romans texts of a past Jerusalem is 1 Thessalonians 2:16, which he also cites in the very same paragraph that he's discussing the Romans.
Okay, so you see it as being more plausible in 1 Thessalonians, but you do see a possibility in Romans, though, I hope.
I see it as possible, but not the most likely interpretation.
Yeah, but if it's backed up, if it's reinforced by 1 Thessalonians, at least that's something.
Yeah. And I'm just looking at the quote. I'm not even looking at the context of 1 Thessalonians 2:16, but it says God's judgment has come upon them, the Jews, at last.
Yeah, that's a lot clearer.
That's speaking about an actual past judgment.
Yeah, that's
like a final judgment on the Jews.
That's like a mini Olivet discourse right there.
And guess what? Looking at Jason Badoon again and his notes on that, 1 Thessalonians 2:16 through 20 is unattested.
Isn't that interesting?
So yeah, it's not attested as being a part of the Apostolicon. Unattested means that we also do not have anything from the fathers confirming it was absent.
Right.
So it doesn't say either way. The church fathers just don't mention it.
But nevertheless, I think it's really interesting the fact that so far all the ones we've looked at
Yep.
are part of this. What's the word for a hole in the text?
I'm sure glad we have Badoom, that it'll enlighten us so much. It's nice to have a source to go to when we're thinking of these individual texts.
Yeah, because I hadn't looked it up in Badoon, but I really appreciate you doing that, Wayne, because it gets the gears spinning.
I was hoping one of these would be attested. That would make things more interesting.
Yeah, right.
Just having them bang, 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 all not be attested, or being absent. I think that's a less interesting, weight of evidence to be. But oh well.
No, yeah, but I think it's relevant that it's happening because Badoon has no vested interest in our discussion.
Exactly.
Right.
It helps because I don't have Badoon.
So basically what we're saying is then, using those passages as evidence that these epistles are 2nd century works doesn't work, because we know the interpolations into the Marcionite Apostolicon are 2nd century, but we don't know how to date the original stratum of them. So it's not an argument against the original stratum of the Pauline epistles being 1st century.
I'll accept that. But then again, I would say that it's not that you're right. That's not an argument for it not being part of the 1st century. But where's the argument for it being part of the 1st century?
Yeah, we can look at the overall evidence and let's just see how the whole stuff fits together. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Of course, we've got to. I mean, Leon, obviously there are apologists who make their case, and it would be interesting to try to look up to see what case they'd make. Obviously, neither Badoon nor Detering is making such a case. So, when you're asking what evidence there is to support these as genuine letters of Paul, I'd have to hear somebody make the case for it.
I think Earl Doherty would make that kind of case. I mean, but we have to hear what his argument is.
Yeah, if he's interested in making that case. I know he presumes it.
Yeah, I think most scholars presume it, and that's something that I've been thinking about lately, and something that I was hoping to talk to Richard Carrier about when I saw him last week. But
I can't buy that Doherty simply presumes that. I'm strongly convinced that Doherty is very familiar with these radical critics, with the Dutch radicals.
I'll accept that.
He quotes their texts all the time.
I'll accept that.
So he's obviously familiar with the arguments against there being an historical Paul, and just doesn't agree with those arguments.
And I'm cool with that, but I would like to hear.
I'm sure he has reasons. I'd like to know what his reasons are.
Yeah, I would like to hear the counter arguments. That's what I'm saying. I really would love to hear a counter argument to Van Manen.
But I don't find it plausible that Doherty is simply assuming that the Pauline.
I stand corrected. I'll accept that.
Yeah, the only way that he could not agree with them after reading the Dutch radicals explain it is that he sees an argument to the contrary.
I accept that, but I will add that I think most of scholarship works on these kind of presuppositions. People just kind of repeat what they've heard.
Yeah, that's true. I would love it if Detering was responding to, because I know there are people out there who are making the case. Like, why is it, like when he talks about Bruno Bauer as the first one, to my knowledge, that completely rejected any letter as being.
Yeah, he was the most famous and the most vocal. Yeah.
And he showed how many couldn't go that far. They thought that was too radical. I'd like to know. They obviously had a case for why they couldn't go there. What was their reason? I would love it if Detering. I would feel much more comfortable with Detering if he actually went point by point over their major arguments. If he ignores their arguments, then that raises red flags to me.
I would agree with that. I wouldn't make it as severe as raising a red flag, but I see what you're saying. Yeah, I agree.
I mean, maybe red flag is too much, but
Yeah. I get you.
Feel much better if he addressed them.
Yeah.
I would really, I mean, seriously, I would love to. Please, somebody, please, if you're listening, please explain to me why the Pauline letters are date to the 50s. I mean, I understand the Van Harnack explanation of the 17 years. That's not what I'm talking about. That's kind of like, okay, if we arbitrarily establish an anchor, yeah, we can get a case out of it. But if we don't have, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm willing to accept them being as late as like the 80s or 90s or even the very early 2nd century.
Right.
But I'm not willing to accept them being much later than that, like 120 at the latest.
Well, there's a range where they fit, but people seem to assume that no, they're from the 50s and 60s, and I'm like, please, demonstrate this to me.
But to me, I see strong evidence that they're pre-Marcionite. I don't think they were invented in Marcion's time. I think they're before his time.
I agree with you on that.
So if we're going to place Marcion at the very beginning of the 2nd century, then these epistles were written at the either very early in the 2nd century or the end of the 1st century.
I agree. My objection has to do with the certainty that they were written in the 50s.
Yeah.
By the way, do either of you guys have a copy of Bart Ehrman's Forged?
I think I do. I might. I have to look.
Because that's where I probably first would go for an example of why does he believe in the 7 authentic letters? He's making a case why he thinks the others are fabricated or forged, but I think he'll also make the case why he thinks these are not.
I'll go take a look, but yeah, ever since his mythicism book, I kind of I've been turned off to him.
Yeah, I think the only reason for putting him in the 50s is somebody taking the Book of Acts too seriously, and I think Acts is fictional.
Right, exactly.
But I'm questioning the people who try to put these epistles in the mid-2nd century or late 2nd century. That just seems implausibly late to me.
I agree.
I'm comfortable with them being from the 70s, 80s, or 90s of the 1st century.
I'd even be, the range is fine with me, but it's the certainty that I object to. It's just like, wait a minute, you have to demonstrate this. You can't just go, everybody knows that.
Yes,
That's just lame.
So anyway, in this chapter, Detering goes on to talk about some of the other radical critics and what their individual views were. He talks about the first Bauer, I forgot his first name.
F.C. Ferdinand.
Ferdinand Bauer, only believing that 4 of them are authentic, and then, I forget the other Bauer's name. Walter Bauer?
Bruno Bauer.
Bruno, okay. Believing that none of them are authentic.
Right. And then he goes into Pearson and Lohman and eventually W.C. Van Manen.
Is there anything we should explain there for the listeners? And we're getting to the point here where I ran out of what I read for this Hangout. I didn't read much past this.
I would actually, at this point, I would like to point out in Dr. Price's Journal of Higher Criticism, there are some essays that you can read some of the stuff, because it's hard to find some of the stuff because it's all in German and Dutch. Yeah. But there are some really good translations of some pertinent essays on that website by Van Manen and by Van Insignia, and I'm not sure how many their Dutch radicals are represented, but I would advise and recommend these because it goes into
RadicalCritic.de you're talking about?
No, Dr. Price's the Journal of Higher Criticism. I'm not sure.
I'll have to look that. Okay. I thought that was just printed. I didn't realize it was on the web.
No, they're on the web, and some of the articles are on the web, and some of them, one of them is Van Manen's. They're just really good. You guys should really take a look at those because this is kind of what we're talking about now.
Yeah, I think in English there's Price's site you just quoted. There's Detering's site, which is in both English and German, and not everything is in both languages.
Right.
But there's a lot of good stuff in English there. And then Price has a book he put out recently called A Wave of Hypercriticism, where he has his own introduction to a translation of Van Manen's works. Am I describing that correctly?
Yeah, I guess so.
Is there any other good sources about these higher critics in English?
Well, that's one of the problems that I've had is I've been looking for a translation of Bruno Bauer for the longest time, and it's impossible. I'm dying for somebody to translate Christ and the Messiah.
Yeah. Now our Hangout has been going for about
Christ
3 hours now.
Really?
So yeah, it's past 9:30 now, and we started at 6:30 my time.
Holy crap! Time flies.
Yeah, and we've gotten to the point where some of us haven't read the chapter past this point.
Okay.
So I'm proposing that we stop, and next Hangout we continue from page 50 and onward.
Okay. Yeah, I second that because that's important. Yeah.
Yeah. And still include chapter 2, and if we don't get through all of chapter 2, so be it.
I agree.
No, that's cool. But yeah, I actually generally follow Detering in this book, so generally, and there's one place that's kind of a doozy that you guys are going to be surprised when I bring it up, where I don't.
Good.
So
yeah. So anyway, I think this is a good place to end this episode, and we'll resume at page 50 later. And by page 50, I mean the page that's numbered 50, and the actual PDF, including the cover page, is actually page 52. But
okay, well that's cool. I'd like to thank everybody for being here and for listening to us. And hopefully we'll see you next week. We'll continue. At this point, next week we'll start to discuss some of the specific Dutch radical authors and what their arguments are.
Yes. So thanks everyone for being here and everybody for listening.